Hey there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec, and in this video I'm going to be tier listing all of my decks according to Wizards of the Coast's newly announced EDH bracket system. And as a bonus treat, I'm not just going to put them into the brackets, I'm also going to sort them and rank them by which ones I think are the strongest. In case you haven't yet heard about this whole bracket and game changer idea and you want to know more, we have 2 other videos linked below going over it in more detail, including an interview with Gavin Verhey. It was fantastic to have him back on the show and hear him discuss this new development in greater detail and the philosophies that helped to guide it. To set the stage real quick, I'll be sorting each of my decks into the proposed brackets from Bracket 1 Exhibition to Bracket 5 CEDH. And to give some other quick additional context, I'd also like to use this other proposed graphic that Rachel Weeks and some other Commander Format panel members concocted, which re-emphasizes some important features of each bracket. I don't know about you, but these ideas really helped anchor me a lot when I was evaluating my deck lists. Now, spoiler alert, but I don't play much CEDH, so the main brackets that you'll find I focus on are Bracket 1, Exhibition, where expressing a silly theme is much more important than winning. Bracket 2, Core, decks that don't contain any game changers, tutors, combos, chaining extra turns, mass land denial. Frankly, those are qualities that are true of a lot of my decks, but my Bracket 2 decks are the ones that I feel most comfortable playing against, for instance, a Precon. Bracket 3, of course, is still social, but steps it up a notch and allows up to 3 game changer cards, and these are decks where I've been quite deliberate about my specific card choices. And Bracket 4, Optimized. When I play these decks, I'm ready to throw down. Remember that the brackets aren't just about meeting technical definitions, it's just another potential conversational tool to help signal your deck intention, finding a way to show other players what maybe they'll enjoy playing against as much as you enjoy playing it. So with all that, let's get bracketing. Alright, let's get into it. I have here my list of 21 current Commander decks. Let's see where they fall within this bracket system and how this bracket system might help me out with the pre-game chats and finding like-minded folks to play against. Let's see how this all shakes out. I'm going to start off with my Wilhelt the Rotcleaver deck, classic blue-black zombies. This was the Wilhelt Precon that I got a while ago, and I upgraded it. So if a bracket 2 is expected to be about the level of a modern Precon these days, and I've upgraded this Precon, I think pretty solidly that lands it very cleanly into spot number 3, upgraded. As a point of clarification on it though, I don't have any game changer cards in this deck. I have not souped it up in the way that a lot of blue-black decks can be souped up, or even in the way that a lot of zombie decks can be souped up. For instance, I know there are a lot of Gravecrawler combos in a lot of zombie decks. That's not the thing that I was interested in with this deck, so I pretty much just committed to, like, yeah, let's just play this a little bit. I want to be a brainless zombie myself while I'm playing it. I just want to om-nom on some zom-zoms. So, of my bracket 3 decks, this one kind of rides the line right between 2 and 3 because it is so devotedly, committedly game changer-less. I expect over time, as the years go on and as the Wilhelt, the original Wilhelt Precon, gets farther and farther into the past, this is the type of deck that might more traditionally fit the description of a Bracket 2. For now, it is obviously an upgraded Precon, so I'm going to say that it's a Bracket 3, but it is kind of characteristic of a lot of my deck roster. A whole lot of these will qualify as game changer-less 3s. I don't like playing a whole lot of those tutors or even the Cyclonic Rift style cards in my decks. I've been moving away from that over the course of the past several years. Wilhelt's a really great example of that. It's definitely a 3, but it might end up being a 2 later on, just given the way that the brackets are very literally described here. And I would also say, it doesn't seem to like win out of nowhere in certain ways that cards in bracket 3 might be able to do. This deck is not doing Torment of Hailfire things, for example. You'll probably see the types of wins that it can create coming from a turn away, that kind of deal. But even then, I still think it's upgraded. I have a lot of fun with it, and it is definitely one of those decks that I enjoy playing against folks who've tuned stuff up and playing against Precon. So it's really riding that line. A soft 3, but I really like where it's wound up. Wilhelt's a really, really enjoyable time. That moves us now to another deck that does graveyard stuff. You'll notice a whole lot of those here in my deck roster. What can I say? I have a brand to uphold. The Mimeoplasm, my oldest and dearest T-Rex boy, slams directly into number 4 optimized. When I was looking through my deck lists on Architect, and it was giving that estimated, hey, based off of your deck and the possible combos that are in it, or the number of game changers that were in it, we estimate that it's probably landing around here. It put at number 4 optimized, and it is absolutely correct. This probably most easily and classically fits the description for me of what a bracket 4 would look like, because I have pushed this one. I've decked it out to the nines as much as I possibly could. I think it has either 4 or 5 game changer cards in it right now. The Ancient Tombs and things like that, Fierce Guardianships. The plan for me with Mimeoplasm is that by the time I actually cast this commander, it has turned into something that will one-shot you. I'm not dilly-dallying with these combinations. I'm going to play it. It will be a Tyrannax Rex with 20+1 counters on it, and it will trample with protection and haste right over somebody and make sure that I can clock them. It doesn't necessarily win the game all at once, because the commander does usually have to it snipes one person, then the next person, then the next person, but it is still doing it very, very, very quickly, and I'm really, really happy with it. Of all of the decks that I've got that are happy to be labeled as bracket 4 optimized, and that I have extremely carefully chosen the cards here, and that I want to play in that really punchy power level, Mimeoplasm classic fit. We'll move from Mimeoplasm to my signature deck, Babala Saga Night Witch, or as I like to call her, my baby Lasagna, who I think is sort of like Wilhelt, another example of a classic game changer list 3. Baba, however, I think is certainly more powerful than my Wilhelt deck. She doesn't have any game changers, but what she's doing is a lot feistier, I think, and a lot more tricky as well. A thing that I want to note about my Babala Saga deck is how much interaction I've got going on in that deck. I really love the interaction points that she's capable of. Some of my favorite tricks in the deck include like using her ability to sacrifice a creature, which then allows the Tragic Slip I have in my hand to be a 1-mana removal spell against an enemy creature. Or I use her ability on an opponent's turn to have my Mortality Spear reduce its mana cost so that I can remove stuff as well. The interaction points that she's capable of are really, really fun, and the types of cards that she's able to sacrifice, like a Sacrifice Outlet in the command zone, is crazy powerful, y'all. I really, really like her. I think she could probably hold her own against the types of things that people are doing in an optimized bracket. I feel a little bit wary about playing her against precons, to be honest. I think she wouldn't pub stomp them necessarily, but they would have quite an uphill battle to face if they went against her. I would probably avoid playing her against precons, but I think that does still solidly land her in the bracket 3 upgraded. Even though she's not playing any game changers right now, the types of stuff that she's doing is the types of stuff that I think game changers are there to try and help combat, if that makes any sense. Like playing a Smothering Tithe against my Babala Saga is the type of thing that you probably should do to make sure that you're keeping me in check. That's the type of opposition I would expect her to meet out there. So even though I'm not playing game changers, she's definitely equipped to play games against decks that are running a few of them. So yeah, I'm going to call her a pretty strong 3 for sure. And I think moving into that too, my Barakos and Folk Hero deck is right after it. And I want to say that this also goes into bracket 3 upgraded, because it is very literally an upgraded precon again. I happened to get the party deck, the black-white party deck, as a gift, and I didn't expect to fall in love with it, and it turns out I totally did. So I've upgraded that precon with Barakos and Folk Hero as my commanders. I just adore this. Much like Babala Saga, I enjoy the puzzle of each turn where you're trying to get a certain number of types, or in this case, creature types, to make sure that you can meet the certain requirements that the commander is asking. But I also love that it is capped. It's not unlimited. It is just like, hey, you're going to get that 4. It is strong. The Barakos precon is very, very strong. But I think this one also still meets the description of being a 3. I don't actually feel quite as confident that it would throw down against things in bracket 4. I would actually say that Babala Saga is going to be a bit more powerful than my Barakos deck. But Barakos deck, it does really, really well for itself, especially when you manage to get a lot of those little creatures in play. Particularly a lot of the clerics and warriors help protect each other, and that's one of the things that makes this deck so interesting and so scrappy, is that, like, Mother of Runes, for instance, helps give things protection. Or I have stuff like Selfless Spirit that is going to also help indestructify the entire battlefield. And each of those creatures is helping to participate in keeping each other alive. And then there's also a smattering of small revival spells in the deck that can make that army come back one last time as well. So the entire deck is very difficult to permanently remove, because each creature kind of operates like another stick in a bundle. Any individual stick can probably be broken, but as a bundle, they're very, very difficult to actually deal with all in totality there. And I just really enjoy what that type of thing is doing. I would play it against precons for sure, and it is powerful enough to probably do some stuff if there's a bracket 4 or 2 of those types of decks in the pod, but I think it's pretty solidly a bracket 3. That'll move me now to my Marina Vendrell deck. Marina Vendrell On its own, if you're building Marina as an Enchantress deck, it is falling somewhere high. Enchantress is such a powerful strategy, but I've done a video about my Marina Vendrell deck, and she, if you are familiar with that video, you'll know the way that I've built her is not in a way to necessarily take advantage of her extraordinarily powerful enters the battlefield effect, where she looks at the top 7 and keeps all those enchantments. What a powerhouse ability. And if you blink her even once, you've probably drawn somewhere between 8 and 10 cards. It is so stinking strong. But when you build a 5-color Enchantress deck, at least my first brews with her, I tried that out, and it didn't feature the rooms that I wanted to build around nearly as much as I would have enjoyed. You know, it kind of felt like the Enchantresses were more the feature of that deck than the rooms were, and I really wanted to build a Marina Vendrell deck to build around her tap ability to lock and unlock rooms. I thought that was really, really fun, and it is still powerful, but yeah, over a very short amount of time when I was building this, I was like, I want the rooms to be the feature here, so let's see what I can do by making this a haunted house themed deck. So she actually is slamming right here into Exhibition, bracket 1. I have built this deck not as a classic Enchantress, but featuring a lot of house-style cards. For instance, cards like False Floor, which aren't very good, but a floor is the kind of thing you'd find in a house. Or I have 4 walls in the deck, or my land base is made out of stuff like clue lands, because, you know, there's a study or a conservatory in the house, stuff like that. The types of lands that you are never gonna see in other 5-color decks, I don't think. So yeah, I've committed really hard to a theme here, and the point of it is to be a little bit silly and make it feel like I'm building out a house, even though rooms can be kind of powerful. The win condition in this deck has come significantly as a 3rd or 4th priority compared to the flavor that some cards can evoke. You know, instead of trying to play a win condition and let me like, ooh, I want to close out this game doing XYZ, I'm playing cards like Defenestrate because my house has windows. That's the type of thing that I'm going for here, so I think that pretty solidly meets the description of being a bracket 1 exhibition, playing for a silly kind of time. By the way, in case I forgot to mention it earlier, if you want to take a look at any of my deck lists, there is a link down in the description below that links to all of my decks, and in fact not just mine, but also my co-host Matt and Dana's decks if you'd like to take a look at theirs as well. And that's just a way, if you want to check my homework, you're totally able to do that. You can take a look at my decks and see how you think they work, and whether I'm incorrect about any of my evaluations here. I want to make sure that I am representing my decks properly, so I'd love input from other folks if you think that maybe some of these decks might belong in a different place than I personally am advocating for them to go. The whole point of this system is to make sure that they find the right homes, right? So input would be really, really welcome. I definitely would appreciate that if you feel like giving those a look. And if you're down there, by the way, don't forget to hit the YouTube like and subscribes while you're at it. I mean, we've seen the numbers. Not everyone who watches this regularly is actually subscribed, so feel free to give that a shot too if you'd like. Going now to my Tana deck here. This is my Commander deck, which also has a very strong theme to it. This is one of my most difficult decks to place, to be honest. For folks who may not be familiar, my Commander deck, I adore this thing so much, and it commits hardcore to a theme as well. Every card in the deck has to say the word Commander on it. So there are a lot of lieutenants in the deck, as an example. The deck features quite a lot of backgrounds or Commander Storm cards, but every card has to say the word Commander on it, and yes, I do apply that restriction also to my mana base. So Command Tower is like the strongest land in my entire deck, that or a Path of Ancestry. Despite that very strong commitment to a theme, though, like when Tana and Tymna are your commanders, they still are really dang good. Like those commanders are better than they needed to be honest. Partner is such a busto mechanic, their first iteration of Partner. And according strictly to the deck list, I think it's important for me to note that there is a card in this deck that actually is a game changer, which is the card Jeska's Will. That's a game changer, so if I'm playing one game changer, by the quote rules or the quote expectations of the bracket system currently, that should cleanly push it up into bracket 3, right? I feel a little bit conflicted about that. To be honest, I actually think that this more properly belongs in bracket 2, despite having one game changer card in it. And this might be a controversial thing, but I know when Gavin was announcing and writing about the bracket system, he was saying that there are still like ways where, yeah, bracket 2 deck could, or bracket 1 deck even could feature a game changer card, and still like these exceptions can totally exist. It might be controversial. If you think I'm totally wrong about this, please feel free to call me out by any means. But I do think that given the hardcore restriction, especially on the mana base of this deck, that one game changer card does not necessarily push it into the same realm as, for instance, what my Babala Saga deck is doing. This is a deck that I feel most comfortable playing against the precon type of level, against that core deck level, and that one game changer, Jessica's Will, I don't personally feel is enough to push it into the realm of a bracket 3 upgraded. And I think the main reason that I feel this way is because of one of the primary characteristics that I think is most important to observe about the difference between brackets 2 and brackets 3, where a deck in bracket 3 might be able to do things that can win the game, quote, out of nowhere, like without a board state where you kind of see coming a huge attack step. I don't think that this deck is capable of winning games in that way necessarily. Most often when I win with this deck, Tana has had to attack a couple times to create a board of Saprolings that I can then use a Commander's Insignia to power up, or that I can then use a Thunderfoot Baloth to power up, things like that. But I've had to like piece that together or keep the commander around for a moment in order for that to occur. That to me, I think, is the reason why I would put Tana and Tymna, my commander deck here, into the core level, despite it having a game changer. It's kind of riding that line where, like, yes, it has a game changer, but it's also committing really hardcore to a theme that you might expect to see in bracket 1, and I'm kind of splitting the difference there by putting it into bracket 2. There might be folks who disagree with me on that one. I think it is a theme deck that still slaps, and to me, I think bracket 2 core just kind of feels like the right home for it. But by all means, if you think I'm wrong about that, definitely let me know where you think this deck should fall instead. Okay, up next, we've got Sir Conrad the Grim, who has to immediately go into bracket 4. As soon as I was talking about my Conrad deck with Matt when the bracket system was announced, my co-host Matt was immediately like, yeah, that's a bro, that's a 4. Just like, of course. The types of stuff that Conrad is capable of doing definitely belongs in a 4. Like, if you've ever gotten Conrad out with a Mind Crank at the same time, or my signature move in this deck is to play like a Tombstone Stairwell, creating zombies on everyone's turn and then them immediately dying, and Conrad does so much damage with that. Conrad's capable of some truly bug nutty stuff. He is not a deck I would ever feel comfortable playing against a precon. That is not the type of thing that I want to do with him. But I will, however, put Mimeoplasm as a more powerful deck than Conrad here in my bracket 4. Conrad has the issue of being well known and being a bit of a lightning rod, is I guess how I'll say it. The Mimeoplasm, by the time I'm playing that one, it's a blue deck. I've either turned Mimeoplasm into something that is hexproof or has a significant amount of protection, or I'm holding up counter magic, whereas Conrad, you have to be very careful about your timing when Conrad is going to finally make his debut, and frankly the rest of the deck probably has to function really well, even if he's not able to find that right timing, because everyone is waiting for him to arrive so that they can kill him. He's got a bit of an uphill battle in terms of what I've announced here from my command zone. As soon as I say, yeah, I'm going to play Conrad, I'm only going to play Conrad against people who know what they're in for, and the fact that it is Conrad draws a lot of attention unto itself. And that's probably the type of thing that you expect in a bracket 4, but like basically, yeah, this deck has a more weak points than my Mimeoplasm deck, is I guess how I'll say it. And that isn't just in the form of someone playing a Rest in Peace to turn off my commander, but also the fact that like you have to time it well because Conrad is such a removal magnet. So I think it has a few more weak points than some of my other bracket 4 decks. It's probably on the lower end of the 4s that I have here, but I cannot call it a bracket 3, not by any means. A deck that I will call a bracket 3 is my Thalisse deck, though. Thalisse is definitely going to go right here into bracket 3. A black-white tokens deck, our preview card from Commander Legends. I just really love this deck. I was so happy that we got this as a preview card, honestly, because I'd been wanting to build black-white tokens for a while, and she was just perfect. She's really good for an uncommon as well, actually. She's practically a doubling season in the command zone. Yeah, it's just a wacky amount of text with her. And a fun thing that she can do is that she will create spirits not just off of other creature tokens you've made, but she'll also create spirits off of any other type of token you made, which is why I do play cards like Smothering Tithe in this deck. My Thalisse deck has 2 Game Changer cards in it. I believe it's a Smothering Tithe, and I want to say the other one is an Ancient Tomb because yeah, Thalisse herself being 5 mana, a lot of the other cards in the deck also kind of hit up on that 4, 5, 6 mana range as well. The plan for me is not an Aristocrats tokens deck here. I do Aristocrats in so many of my other strategies. The plan here is for me to take a board full of tokens and make them lethal with a Jazal Goldmane or some such effect. There's quite a lot of stuff that those 1/1s can suddenly turn into when I drop a Mirror Entity, for instance. I really adore her. She's definitely, I think, meets almost perfect the description of a bracket 3. She isn't playing more than 4 Game Changers. Her abilities are very, very powerful indeed, but there's also quite a lot of checks against her as well. You might be able to see some of the things that she can do coming in a way that I think a precon deck would be able to handle, and probably, you know, a well-coordinated bit could take her down pretty comfortably, I would say. So yeah, probably one of my most classic descriptions of a bracket 3 deck. Next up, we're going to have Karazikar the Eye Tyrant, a Rakdos Goad deck. And while Karazikar was a commander from a precon, I believe the Prosper precon from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, I don't know that I can necessarily call this an upgraded level. I'm not playing any Game Changers in this deck. I used to, I think at one point I flirted with a Jeska's Will in here, but I've pretty much committed to taking that out. And I think at one point I had a Dockside Extortionist and some other pretty high power like dragons that create a lot of treasures as well, but over time it didn't necessarily feel like the move. And another interesting part about it is that not only does it not have any Game Changers, it's also, according to my own game data, one of my losingest decks. I do a thing, if folks are familiar with the channel, where I track my game data because I want to make sure that my decks aren't punching too hard, basically. That's been a fun experiment, and it's been fun to do episodes about that, looking over any patterns that might emerge from those. But Karazikar is consistently one of my decks that loses the most often. So I think that this is also going to meet the descriptions of being a bracket 2 core deck. Like, it's a fun strategy. The precision goad that this commander is capable of is so enjoyable to me, but I've also lost to my own Karazikar life loss draw triggers so many times. Like, you need to get a Whip of Erebos in play ASAP, or else you're totally going to drain yourself. It's super enjoyable, but like, it does sometimes have some difficulty officially crossing the finish line at the end of the game if things get down to a one-on-one, which is probably a characteristic of many goad decks out there. There are some cards that definitely help you out with that, Hot Pursuit and such like that, but it can be difficult to organize, and you are playing with fire a little bit because a goad deck relies upon your opponents having stuff in play. You want to sometimes keep your opponent's creatures around so that you can actually get benefits off of them, which is a different dynamic than a lot of other decks out there where you want to make sure your opponents don't have anything at all so that none of their stuff can interrupt you. You're playing on a risky edge here a little bit. So yeah, Karazikar is very enjoyable, but I think it is most suited to play at that core level against, for instance, other precons. I think it would be very, very comfortable there, and frankly might even get a little bit raffle stomped by some of the more powerful precons that exist out there. Like anything from the Modern Horizons 3 precons, I think gives Karazikar a total run for its money. As a result of all that, I'm going to be moving it to the low end of my bracket 2 core experience decks out there. I think the wins that it's capable of are the types of wins that you will most likely see coming. They're not always going to be the type of thing that is out of nowhere, and even if it is, it's the type of thing that I require another opponent to be doing well in order for that to all come together, and I certainly don't think it's in the same tier as, for instance, my Babala Saga deck. I think she would eat Karazikar for breakfast. Okay, let's move now. Opposite of red and black is going to be a Bont deck of mine. Sarah Jane 6th is what I call it. This is Sarah Jane Smith, who's making a bunch of clue tokens as she investigates every time I play historic spells, and she is the Doctor's companion to the 6th Doctor, which is the 6-mana Simic commander that can copy your historic spells and make them non-legendary, the first historic spell that he sees. What a treat. The 6th Doctor is very, very fun, but the whole deck is actually much more built around her than it is him. I actually quite like Sarah Jane just continually making clues, because frankly, I saw a lot of people were having fun with cards like Academy Manufactor, and I wanted a little piece of that action. The whole deck is actually built to turn all of those extra random pieces of metal that I have around and use them to pump up the likes of a Bronze Guardian, which gets more powerful for each artifact you have in play. This deck does contain a game changer card in it, which is Urza, Lord High Artificer. And like, Urza's obviously wild. Like, all of your clues suddenly tapping for mana, anyone who's played it knows, ooh, dang, that is really powerful. But the reason I wanted Urza in there is because I wanted to make those construct tokens, and I wanted to double them up whenever I could, because those construct tokens are a payoff for all of the clues that one of my commanders has been making steadily over the course of the game. So yeah, it kind of fits into that very classic tchotchke type of deck archetype, and I think that very cleanly lands it into the bracket 3 upgraded section that we're now very familiar with. It's possible that I might, for instance, put a Smothering Tithe into this deck as well to get even more little bits of artifice out there that will pump things up even more. I think I flirted with it and I wasn't sure whether I wanted to commit to it being that type of deck or not, but I do have an Urza in there already, so frankly I might throw one more in there because that does seem to be kind of like the expected, yeah, this is what we know is going to happen here. I enjoy the payoff of finding all those types of cards that will get bigger and bigger for each artifact that you have, but I also enjoy playing some of those cards like Rise and Shine that will take that board full of metal and then suddenly make it super lethal, or a Cyberdrive Awakener, for instance, those types of things. Yeah, it's a really fun place to operate. I don't build a whole lot of non-black decks, but this is totally the type of deck that is really my jam, and I'm going to say very cleanly a bracket 3 deck here. Maybe something that I could flirt with, like taking Game Changers out or putting more of them in. There's probably some flexibility there, but I'm pretty comfortable with where it's at right now. Real quick, before I move on, I actually just realized I forgot to place these in terms of their power when I was putting them in here. I think I forgot to do it with Thalisse here, and I'll correct that right now by scooching Babala Saga over to the end. I think that she is more powerful than my Sarah deck and my Thalisse deck, just by a skosh a little bit here, despite the fact that both Thalisse and Sarah Jane 6th have game changer cards in them. I think that Babala Saga's probably a little feistier in certain ways and a little trickier, maybe is the way to say it. There's a straightforwardness to both Thalisse and Sarah Jane that I think folks who are familiar with those strategies will be able to anticipate, whereas there's a wiliness to Babala Saga that I think pushes her farther up the edge. I'm a little divided about whether I think Thalisse or Sarah Jane is a more powerful deck. I think I'm going to give the edge here to Sarah Jane 6th because, frankly, of a little bit of the blue. Doing some trickinesses there with blue kind of helps. But also, tokens are the type of thing that board wipes can interact with, whereas a whole lot of clues that suddenly get animated out of nowhere, like landing a Cyberdrive Awakener, that kind of thing, is a little bit less easy to interact with from your opponents. I think they certainly can be, but it's just a tad more difficult for opponents to be able to anticipate or see coming. So I think I'm going to give the edge to her here. I think that this is probably, so far with my bracket 3 decks, I think this is the correct lineup from not quite as strong to like, ooh, we're feisty. I think this is the correct thing. So, all right, with that now, we'll move on to the next one. Up next, we've got Skoa. I don't even know. This is my mono red Blink Make Copies deck with a very funky commander indeed. I did a video on this deck. I think I called the video "This Deck Shouldn't Exist" because Skoa is so silly. It's a 6 mana 4/4 with a Grandeur ability. So if you have extra copies in your deck, you can discard them to get some cool effects. But we're playing Commander. Like, there are no extra copies of them. That, unless you're jumping through 8 billion hoops, probably can't happen in the world of EDH. I just am using this because it's a 6 mana, it lands and it does 4 damage somewhere. I just think that effect is very fun. I kind of took this deck as a challenge for myself to see what can I do. And I'd actually been flirting with red decks for a while. Like a Rayanya deck was something that I had for a little bit, because Rayanya is really fun. It makes a whole bunch of copies of something, but Rayanya was nutty powerful. And having the Blink engine or the copy engine in the command zone was doing things to the deck that I didn't necessarily want. I wanted more of the Rayanya type of cards in the 99, and I wanted the Blink target in the command zone. And that's exactly what Skoa is. As weird and strange as that is, I just really enjoy having those Conjurer's Closet types of effects that fill out the whole rest of the deck, and they've just got one cool target that you can use. There are some backups that I've got in the deck too, like Burning Sun's Avatar and the like, but the whole point of this deck is to land the commander and have it do a whole bunch of weird damage and maybe blink it or make some extra copies. The copies will of course die because they're legendary, but it's fun to do a sudden burst of damage after a lot of build-up. I'm going to put this into bracket 2 core. It has one game changer in it currently, that is a Jeska's Will, but I'm happy to take the Jeska's Will out of this deck because I want it to belong not in the upgraded section. I think this is doing a couple of silly things. And like, don't get me wrong, those things can be very powerful. Like if you've got a Fiery Emancipation out and then you cast this commander and make a copy of it, or you blink it or whatever, that's a good chunk of damage. But it is also the type of thing that requires quite a lot of buildup, where I'm spending quite a lot of time getting some mana rocks out, and then playing a Conjurer's Closet, and then playing a Gratuitous Violence, and then playing, like, it takes some time and you're a little bit defenseless until that point. And then by the time that Skoa arrives, it can be a pretty big impact, but there's also quite a lot of restrictions that come with that. This is, by definition, a mono red burn deck, but it's not doing mono red burn in the same quick melt everyone's life totals ways that, for instance, a Perforos mono red burn deck would be capable of. Like, those feel to me like a very different caliber, a very different tier. There's an element of jankiness or zaniness to what this deck is up to, and it's kind of just a challenge to myself to see whether I could make this commander that isn't suited for commander. It was built for limited or for constructed, and I still wanted to see whether I can make it work, and I think I do, but I think there's some hoops here, and I'm pretty deliberately trying to aim it into exactly this core category by doing some kind of silly stuff. So yeah, happy to put it in here. I think, though, that it's gonna have to land right here in the middle between these two. Like, my commander deck, I think, is probably, despite the mana restrictions that exist in that deck, it's probably going to feel a little bit more consistent compared to Skoa, which has, straight up, there are going to be a lot of times where that Skoa deck just has a bad hand, and it is very difficult for me to claw my way into a game or out of a very bad position. So yeah, I think it belongs here. It's not one of my most powerful Bracket 2 decks by any means. Moving now to Yennett Cryptic Sovereign, one of my favorites, and honestly one of the decks that taught me the most in terms of de-optimizing and detuning things. This is a deck that I've gone on a tremendous journey with, because the deck used to contain a whole lot of tutors. I was happy to play Vampiric Tutors and Mystical Tutor type of effects to put powerful cards on top of my deck, get an attack with Yennett, who would then flip the top card, and if it was odd, she would play it for free. And my initial targets were things like an Expropriate. That was the kind of thing that I really started to grow weary of, I suppose. I really like what Yennett is able to do. Cheating stuff into play is like one of my favorite things to do in Magic, but she got a reputation. Once people knew what my deck was capable of and the types of things that I could cheat into play, then no one could suffer her to live ever. Everyone had to immediately get rid of Yennett, or else they were risking the Expropriate level of gameplay. That created a weird sort of a feedback effect, I think, where since I knew that Yennett was not likely to live very long, I felt even more pressure to protect her with really powerful counter magic and to tutor powerful stuff on top of the deck to make sure that her first attack, which she'd probably only get one attack, to make sure that it would be impactful. And that is a thing that I eventually had to kind of break the cycle, because that wasn't giving me what I wanted from this commander. I have rolled all of that back, taken out the tutors, taken out the Expropriate level cards, and instead the deck is a lot more devoted to things like Baneful Omen, which is like my absolute favorite card in the deck, where I just want a whole bunch of cards in the deck to use the top card of my library as a way of potentially dealing some damage or having some fun impact on the game. Cards like Twilight Prophet as well. The top of my deck is an unusual, unconventional weapon, is the whole point of this. And if I do attack with Yennett and get a fun payoff, it isn't something that I've tutored to put there, it's something that I brainstormed to put there. I had to already have those cards in my hand or draw them organically, and then I could put them back. I do have some stuff like a Scroll Rack or Sensei's Divining Top. Those are certainly powerful cards, but they are not the same beasts as tutors. And there are even now moments where I feel more comfortable doing a blind attack with Yennett. I don't know what's on top of my deck, but I have increased the density of odd cost cards in my library to make sure that there can be maybe more accuracy by volume rather than accuracy by precision. And with that has come a better expectation of what that deck is able to do, and people are not necessarily gunning for her the same way that they used to when they knew that my deck was capable of casting Expropriates with relative ease. So all of that is to say that this deck has gone on a journey. It very much my initial drafts of it were totally bracket 4 optimized. They fit that description to a T. But now I have rolled all of that back, and I don't think it has a single game changer card in the deck whatsoever, and I'm very happy to say that it is landing here in bracket 3 upgraded. In terms of power level here, I'm pretty sure I'm going to place her right between Wilhelt and Barakos. I think she's just a shade underneath the Barakos deck, but she's really evenly matched with Barakos would be my expectation. I think it's fair to cop to the fact that there are cards in this deck that maybe could be labeled as game changers in the future. Like I've got a Teferi's Protection in here, for instance, and if the game changer list ever does expand, it's possible that a card or two in this deck will end up being labeled as, yeah, this is bracket 3 upgraded. It's got at least whatever number of game changers in it. There's a possibility for that, but I'm happy with it staying in that lane. It's the kind of thing that I think a pretty decent precon can absolutely go toe-to-toe with. So yeah, happy to call Yannette a bracket 3 upgraded deck, and I'm really happy with the lessons that I've learned from her, because frankly I think that those lessons that I learned about her reputation and the tutors and all of that, those were lessons that I was able to apply that had kind of a ripple effect on a lot of my other deck building, and tutoring so much in my first drafts of her made me lose a little bit of the luster on it and learn to embrace the variance that can come and the excitement that comes from that variance with a lot of my other strategies, and I've just really fallen in love with where she has landed as a result of all of that. Next, we're going to go to a Golgari commander that I frankly think is kind of underrated by a lot of folks out there. Winter's Cynical Opportunist. Duskmorn precon that I upgraded, so like right away we got to put it into the upgraded. Like it is not the stock precon list. I've put quite a bit of thoughtfulness and care into the card choices that I'm putting here. I think that Winter got kind of a bad rap because it was very immediately compared to like Marin of Clan Neltoth, and Marin is famously powerful. But what Marin did, and the reason that I took apart my Marin deck from years ago, was because it would recur a lot of the same things over and over again, like a Spore Frog, and like reduce enemy capability of interacting with me in combat meaningfully. Or it would recur quite a lot of Fleshbag Marauder sacrificey type cards. And I personally eventually grew a little wearisome of that repeated play pattern. So I took that apart, and when Babala Saga came out, I was like, oh, the variants and playing around with card types, this is so much fun. And honestly, Winter allowed me to kind of visit some of the same stuff, because with the Delirium effect, Winter is also playing around with different card types, but where Babala Saga cares about card types on cards that are relatively cheap to cast, or like for instance artifact lands or creatures that are also enchantments, like multi-type things, Baba wants them to be relatively low to the ground, whereas Winter lets me play around with those multiple card types on the higher end of the spectrum. Because what Winter can do, even like the first turn that he arrives on the field, is he can revive a 7-drop enchantment from my graveyard. He's reviving not just creatures, but artifacts, like an Akroma's Memorial. Like an early Akroma's Memorial is wild. And yes, it has a finality counter on it, but in most of my decks, if I play a 7-mana enchantment and someone destroys it, I'm probably not going to usually be able to get back one of those cards anyway in most of my other decks. So to me, the finality counter, I don't even necessarily mind it. I am happy to keep moving on, filling the graveyard, and playing around with reviving some very high-end cards here. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't think it's my most powerful bracket 3 deck or anything. I'm going to slot it right down here, I would say. It's got some caps on its power level, some restrictions on what it can do for sure, but I still really, really enjoy it. I love the way that it creates a new type of puzzle for me to deal with, and that it lets me play around with some really high-cost stuff. There are some limitations on what it can do, but they're limitations that I really enjoy the experience of trying to navigate during a game. I don't have any game changers in this deck, but I'm perfectly comfortable with that. Maybe I'll flirt with 1 or 2 here, but honestly, I kind of doubt it. I like it being yet another of my game changerless 3 type of decks, which is true of this and this and this and this. Like, a lot of my decks are game changerless 3s, and Winter's yet another one, but that's just a mode that I really enjoy operating in, and Winter's a very great example of that too. And you know what, that's also going to be true of this one, my Ishai and Rayhan +1/+1 counters deck. I'm also going to call that one a game changerless 3 deck as well. It's a deck that I too, much like the Yannette deck or other things, I have scaled back the power on. I took all the fetch lands out of the deck, for instance, but it is still doing some pretty gnarly stuff. Ishai collects a lot of counters, but Rayhan is really my star of the show, moving those counters around. And when you move counters around and you have something like a branching evolution in play, that can get really spicy. And I love loading up a pinata type of creature that will, like a Chasm Skulker, that will just explode into a whole bunch of tokens if people try to disrupt my board and all the stuff that I'm, trying to do with it. There are some ways that it can win in that quote out of nowhere type of way. Like if you get counters on a Crystalline Crawler, for example, people probably know how busto that card is, but I don't think I'd feel comfortable calling it a bracket 4 optimized. I don't think it is the ultimate best example of what a +1 counter deck could do out there, and I don't think it would necessarily hold its own very regularly against the types of things that I would anticipate occurring in a contemporary bracket 4 optimized type of deck if you expect to see a lot more combos and stuff like that. There's some big vulnerabilities to a +1 counter strategy, first and foremost keeping creatures in play in the first place. So a pretty comfortable 3, but I would place it probably higher than my Babala Saga deck if I had to guess. I'm a little torn about that. I'm not entirely sure, but I think I will actually commit to, like, yeah, the +1 counters and the silly stuff that this can do. Once it gets going, it gets going. You slam a Greater Good in here, for instance, and you've got a creature with even a couple +1 counters on it, and then suddenly you're drawing like 10 cards, moving those counters to other places. It's explosive in ways that even sometimes take me by surprise. So maybe I'm misremembering here. I don't play this deck all that often, but I do think that actually it might end up being just a skosh more powerful than my Babala Saga deck, if I had to guess. Babala Saga is very, very powerful, but +1 counter synergies can really soup themselves up quite admirably. So I think I'm gonna say that that lands at the top end of my bracket 3s. Moving now to my Titania deck, who immediately bracket 4. This, I think, is my most powerful deck. If I have any deck here that might be able to hang with any type of CEDH crowd, I would anticipate that it is Titania, Protector of Argoth. Making those elementals for every land that I sacrifice. When you get a Zurin Orb in play, you make so many creatures. And when you have an Elemental Bond in play, you draw so many cards. And when you have those Splendid Reclamations to get them all back, and Lotus Cobras that are giving you all those manas, or you're scape shifting, even one scape shift sometimes feels like, oh, I'm doing something unfair with this deck. It is wild. It only has one Game Changer card in it, that's a Glacial Chasm, but I truly just think that this is the most powerful deck that is currently in my arsenal. It has won games on turn 6 with, I would call, relative ease. I am very, very careful about where it is that I actually want to play Titania. She, I would also say, has fewer weaknesses than even my Mimeo or my Conrad deck, fewer points where she can be knocked completely out of the game. She recovers her mana so easily, and she has quite a lot of fast mana to her benefit as well with the exploration style effects. This is a deck that I would put at the top end because of her consistency compared to some of my other bracket 4s. So yeah, Titania, one of my favorite pieces of art in the game by one of the best artists, Magali. Oh, you do such great work, and especially with Titania, what a beautiful, beautiful commander. I love Titania so much, and I truly think that she's my most powerful deck. That'll take us to Vohar, my black-blue Reanimator deck. And I mean very classic Reanimator. Vohar is a 2-drop Merfolk Looter in the command zone. I just tap, discard, and it has a whole bunch of text that I think I've never even activated or ever cared about, like if you have instants and sorceries and stuff in your graveyard. I don't care. I am just trying to discard a huge creature into the graveyard and then bringing it back with a Reanimate and Animate Dead. The deck is running a whole bunch of those, just get back something from the graveyard, but the types of creatures I'm getting back are what makes this deck so wild. I'm getting back stuff like Archfiend of Despair, like Archon of Cruelty, and things like that, like just Haymaker after Haymaker with alarming consistency, and not only that, but also having the blue counterspells to back that type of stuff up and defend my board once I get that good position makes Vohar way better than I thought it was. This deck is the one that actually, when I looked over my game data, ended up having the most surprising results to me. This deck was way more powerful than I thought it was. And I have learned that I have to be much, much more careful with where it is that I play it. It is not suitable to play against a precon. It is going to stomp them. This is the type of thing that the rest of the table would have to, from the jump, try and coordinate to take down. Importantly, there's one game changer currently in this deck, and that is a Cyclonic Rift, which, to be honest, I'm not even super in love with in the deck, because as a Reanimator deck, my actual mana abilities tend to be pretty low to the ground, and getting 7 mana is kind of a stretch for this deck most of the time. But it is the type of deck that I've noticed being so powerful and that I've considered, do I just go ahead and put like the Fierce Guardianships and stuff like that into this deck? That's the type of space that it's capable of operating at. So I actually think I'm going to have to put this into bracket 4 optimized. I don't know that I can call this a bracket 3 upgraded, despite the fact that by the literal definition, it's only got one game changer. You know, the game changers are not the end all be all here, right? There are other factors that go into that, and I want to make sure that I am honest about what this deck is really capable of and where I feel comfortable playing it and who's going to have fun playing against it. And I think that is going to be the bracket 4 optimized way more than a bracket 3 upgraded. Within that list, I think it ranks just under my Mimeoplasm deck, to be honest, and just above Sir Conrad. The reason I'm going to give the edge to it there is because of its counterspell capability. Conrad has some weak points that sometimes it's hard for mono black to defend against, whereas Vohar, with the access to blue here, can really protect itself very well once I establish my board position, and I establish that board position pretty regularly. It's a little bit more gradual than what these decks are up to. Frankly, if there's any deck of mine where I'll more properly lean into the bracket 4 optimized, maybe run some more game changers, this is probably the deck of mine that will experience a bit more of those upgrades to be like, yeah, you know what, I am acknowledging this is definitely the spicy type of deck, so let's get more of those spicy type of cards in here. It might be the kind of thing that I do in the future, we'll see. A big 1-2 punch for me here. Honest Rutstein is next, and this one also feels tough to place, not gonna lie. So Honest Rutstein, this is a very classic Aristocrats deck, just green-black Aristocrats. To be honest, it's extremely reminiscent of a black-white Teysa Karlov deck, just sacrificing creatures to do a whole bunch of damage. The Blood Artists, the Conrads in the 99, things like that. Like most of my decks, it isn't doing combos, it doesn't have any tutors in the deck, any game changers in here, but it is remarkably powerful. Like, Honest Rutstein's ability to discount your creature spells allows me to double spell so quickly. And in terms of my bracket 3s, I'm going to put it right at the top end. I think this one is really riding the line between being a bracket 3 upgraded and a bracket 4 optimized. Like, there's a world in which I'm kidding myself and this is supposed to be bracket 4. I think, though, that it's probably just at the end here. If I wanted to put game changer-esque cards in here, maybe I could, but I don't necessarily feel like it even needs to. Rather, I think that some of the cards that it currently features are the types of cards that could be labeled as game changers later on, like Phyrexian Altar and stuff like that. It's not letting me do things that go infinite, but it's letting me do things that go enough. And if the game changer list were ever to expand, it's possible that any types of cards that they add to that list might be the types of cards that turns out I'm already running in this Honest Rutstein deck. It's Aristocrats, but it is brutally good at being Aristocrats. Cool, now we're going to move to Minthara, a commander that I have drafted so many times in Baldur's Gate Limited. I've really enjoyed drafting that set, and I've enjoyed drafting her. I think I've done it 3 or 4 times, and I've won every time that I've built her. She is a really good commander, and I wanted to finally honor her by giving her a proper place in one of my command zones. And the way that I did that, I made a video about this recently, was to build a Minth Hair deck, which is built around what else but hair appearance, making a whole bunch of tokens that Minthara's experience counters will then buff up and make pretty wild. That said, though, when I was building it, I didn't want this to be another deck that kind of competes in my black-white tokens category with, like, you know, my Felice deck, for instance. I already had black-white tokens and it felt a little bit odd to have yet another. So I was looking for another restriction that wouldn't just make me feel like, yeah, this is also a deck where I play the Smothering Tithe-esque type of cards, and I was looking for something, and I landed on her being a Pauper deck, an uncommon commander where every card in the deck is a common, and those hair apparents fit the bill really well, and I had to find a whole bunch of other interesting cards that also fit that bill, enabling her ability but still providing me some of the necessities that I need, like removal and stuff like that, but only within the realm of commons, you know, no Path to Exiles, none of that stuff. And it was a really fun brewing experience. Check that video out. I think it was really enjoyable. Admittedly, Pauper is not a thing that I have quite a lot of experience with, and this is not a deck that I've gotten the opportunity to play very much yet. It is a very new addition to my roster. This is a deck that I have still much to learn about, and frankly, I don't just have much to learn about this deck, but I have a lot to learn about the Pauper version of EDH as well. So I am hesitantly going to say that this is my other bracket 1 exhibition deck. More powerful than Marina Vendrell, my Haunted House themed deck, because Minthara with some tokens, that can, you know, rack up to get decently punchy, and you kind of know what the win condition there is going to be. She's an anthem right there from the command zone. But the way that she is winning the game by using only commons, is a little bit janky, I suppose you could say. And to me, there's so much about the commitment to the theme here that is the focus compared to other things that are the focus at brackets 2 or 3, where, you know, you're trying to like streamline some stuff. This is not what I would call necessarily a streamlined deck. But also, this is not a thing that I know a whole lot about, and so any other proper Pauper players that are out there, if you think that maybe I'm misevaluating where this deck actually lands in terms of the things that Pauper decks are capable of, by all means let me know. I would really, really like to learn more about this, and I would like to get hopefully some more reps with it under my belt. But for now, I think I'm evaluating it correctly by labeling it here as another exhibition deck, but it's possible that I'm kind of underestimating it here, and that actually does belong a little bit higher. Again, though, happy to learn if anyone out there has more experience with Pauper and wants to take a look through the list and has any advice about what they think that deck really is capable of and where it might be more honestly represented. By all means, let me know. Down to the last 3. Here we have what I affectionately refer to as my Dr. Whomst deck, which begins with the 9th Doctor, but this is a Rule 0 deck, where every time the Doctor dies and goes back to the command zone, the Doctor regenerates into the next Doctor. So it will go from the 9th Doctor into the 10th Doctor, and if that one goes back to the command zone, it will also turn into the 11th Doctor, and it progresses from there. This is a Jeskai time counters deck. I do not have a Doctor's Companion for this deck. I abandoned that in exchange for the request to, can I have this commander, quote, regenerate, and I do keep the commander tax between those regenerations as well, things like that. And it is a fun time. I'm going to say that this, despite the fact that it is not the original precon, the timey-wimey precon, I do still think it plays in roughly the same type of area as that precon, or like around the area of most precons. It's doing some very fun time counter stuff, but that is very much a strategy that you can see projected in advance exactly what it is planning to do. There's some really fun cards in it here, but there's also quite a lot of stuff that I put in there purposefully because I think it evokes quite a lot of smiles. For instance, the card Telling Time feels right for a Time Lord deck. Or I'm playing Aeon Engine, another one of our preview cards from way back in Commander 2019. Really fun card that reverses the game's turn order, because that feels to me like what a Time Lord should do. This deck wants to play around with time, and it's kind of funny. Very solidly a bracket 2 core deck here, because there's room for stuff that makes me smile, and it's a little bit silly. And that feels like the right place for a Rule 0 deck of mine to land. I don't want to build a Rule 0 deck that is going crazy powerful and is using a rules bend to try and really trounce the table. I like that my Rule 0 deck is operating at a much more moderate speed, I think. Then we have a mono white deck, Toby Beastie Befriender, another relatively new deck of mine that, I'm gonna be honest up front, I'm not sure if I'm going to end up keeping it together for ever, but it is an experience that I've really enjoyed brewing around. It is quite a lot like Skoa Embermage, to be honest, because it's yet another thing that I enjoy blinking or making copies of or whatever right there from the command zone. Just blink Toby, get a 4/4. Blink Toby, get a 4/4. Teleportation circle, all that type of stuff. And it's just an enjoyable time. I don't have any game changers in this deck, and I think that this is yet another that fits very solidly into bracket 2. To be honest, I think it's probably on the very low end of my bracket 2s as well. Like, there's some very fun stuff that mono white tokens is capable of doing with cards like Caretaker's Talent, for instance. Like, I really do enjoy that, but it's a mono white deck that is very sensibly paced, I guess is maybe the way that I should say it, compared to some of the other spicier stuff that maybe we see other tokens decks out there doing. But I just really enjoyed it. I wanted to build a mono white deck. I'm not sure if this will be the forever home for me for mono white. I might end up going back to, for instance, Audric Lunarch Marshall, a deck that I took apart a very long time ago. Maybe I'll revisit it instead, but I'm experimenting a lot more with stuff in mono white, and Toby's been really fun. But yeah, I'd say that this definitely deserves to be his home. He's on the low end of my core decks, but he's doing some really fun core things. Last up is Virtus, who is not very good. This is Virtus and Gorm, a little annoying little guy who, when he pokes you, will make you lose half of your life rounded up. This deck is so annoying, and I'm going to slam it right into bracket 3, but at the very low end of bracket 3. This is one of my losingest decks. in part because it looks so scary. No one suffers Virtus to live. No one wants to be on the receiving end of that, where you take 1 point of damage from him and then he drops you from that 39, he makes you lose half your life rounded up and you're down to 19 after a single attack. That early, that looks gnarly. Like, nobody wants to deal with that, and everyone has a very good justification for being like, let's get rid of that guy, or let's just straight up attack Joey, because how annoying that is. Totally perfect justification to attack me right away. I call this my Xenos Paradox deck, though, because as it turns out, cutting things in half over and over again is not a very solid way to win games, because it doesn't necessarily help you cross the finish line. And an irony of this deck is that I think most of the time I end up kind of serving as a smokescreen, where I've drawn so much attention in a way that frankly this deck cannot keep up with. I cannot deal with that much heat with people killing the commanders and probably attacking me because of how annoying my commander is. I end up becoming kind of a smokescreen for other folks who are going to do something that is probably going to deal even more damage than what my Virtus was up to. Like, yeah, Virtus can take a decent amount of life away by poking somebody on that first initial hit, but someone who plays an overwhelming stampede on turn 7 or something like that is probably going to drop somebody straight from 40 to 0 compared to what I was doing. So it's a fun thing that I have to like try and negotiate the socialness of it as well. It's a crappy deck, but I just love it so dang much. The complicating wrinkle on this is effects like wound reflection. Like, yeah, cutting stuff in half isn't a very reliable winning strategy up until the point that you're playing a card that will double someone's life loss that turn, and a wound reflection or an Archfiend of Despair will make up that difference for you. I did not initially have those cards in my drafts of this deck because I thought they might be too mean. I put them in there though because when I didn't have effects like that, games dragged on for a while. I could almost never reliably kill anyone with this deck, and I don't want games to drag on, so I did eventually put them in there, but they can still sometimes feel mean. And even with them in there, this is still, when I look over my game data, one of my losingest decks, because everyone is just like, that thing's annoying, and they kill me right away, which, you know, fair enough. But I enjoy the dynamic that it brings to that. So I don't think that this necessarily meets the conditions of being a bracket 2 core deck, even though it is probably going to get completely trounced by a lot of more modern or contemporary precons that are out there. I think they would just totally demolish this thing, but it is capable of a handful of spicier stuff, and that wound reflection-esque type of card can be some of that quote out of nowhere feeling stuff, but I do purposefully try and make sure that those cards aren't deployed successfully until the later stages of the game. Like, I don't have a Bloodletter of Akhlazots in this deck, for instance. Not only am I not running tutors and not running combos and not running game changers in this deck, I'm also not playing even the cheapest versions that are available of those Bloodletter effects. And I instead try to focus on some of the sillier stuff that this thing is capable of. A lot of other life cut in half cards like Raving Dead are here as well, even though they're not particularly good in the deck. I just enjoy that kind of vibe. So yeah, I don't think it meets the conditions of being a bracket 2, even though from my own evaluation, power-wise, it's probably even less good than a precon, simply because of the social dynamic that it immediately engages in there. But in terms of the cards and the types of things that it could theoretically do, I think bracket 3 makes us good sense for it, and that is the final one here that I'm going to call my game changer list. Bracket 3 is a good way to round things out here for me, I would say. So those are my decks, bracketed and ranked within those brackets by their power level as well. And this is a fun list. I've really enjoyed this exercise, but there's one last thing that I want to do, one final flourish I want to do before I close this video out, and that has to do with this section right here. I think I probably mentioned it earlier, but very clearly I don't play a whole lot of CEDH. It's just not my lane, nothing against it, it just doesn't tend to be the place where I tend to operate. But I feel bad leaving this completely empty, so I wanted to put one last hypothetical in here. What if I did have a CEDH deck? What would it be? And there are 3 options that I think would exist here, and they are these guys. Anya Falconwrath would be my first consideration. This is a well-known deck that uses that madness ability of untapping Anya to just discard and draw and discard and draw and just dig through your deck to find most commonly a combo. And I enjoy the tension that can exist in combo decks where you're trying to choose the right moment to make make sure that the coast is actually clear. I don't think this is necessarily a very powerful CEDH deck at the current moment in the meta, but it is the type of thing that I just do enjoy. The same is true of Kirik, son of Yawgmoth as well. Mono Black Storm is the type of thing that I think I would really enjoy dabbling in. I used to have a Kirik deck. I built one, played one game with it, and immediately was like, oh no, this is not what I wanted. I'm dominating way too much of the chess clock, so I took it apart very, very fast. But if I were to play in a more cutthroat and competitive area, I think I'd be pretty comfortable with bringing that back. I really enjoy the dynamic of hurting yourself a little bit to make your opponents hurt even more, and also having to choose your moment with a mono black storm deck sounds very, very fun to me too. So yeah, Kirik would also be another strong consideration, but I think the winner ends up being Yidris Maelstrom Wielder. I also used to have a Yidris deck, and it was nutty. It was way too good. Even when I tried to temper it down, it was still like, oh wow, what this is up to is absolutely just buck wild. I played a Yidris deck against my mom because, you know, my family is part of my meta. And yeah, I'm never going to make that mistake again because I want to get invited back to Thanksgiving, you know? Yeah, I think Yidris really captures what it is that I would be after, because there's quite a lot of chaining things together and choosing the right moments and trying to find your windows that I think brings in an interesting amount of tension that I would probably enjoy were I to play CDH. Again, though, this is a hypothetical. I just wanted to make sure that this last category didn't feel too lonely. In truth, my roster actually looks more properly like this, but if I were to build a CEDH deck, I imagine that I would end up gravitating towards the Yidris Maelstrom Wielder. But, you know, we'll see. As it stands, that's going to be where my decks fall within the brackets. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed a journey through my decks. Remember that if you want to take a look at any of these lists, they're linked down below. Let me know if you agree or disagree with any of my placements. I know I had a few controversial ones in there, and I think that this is my best representation of my lists, but I would love to hear more from other folks whether they agree, because this whole system is about finding like-minded players out there and making sure that everyone's able to get a good game in with other players. Thanks so much for watching. Remember to hit the buttons that make YouTube happy, and as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.